Hello and welcome to today's vlog. Today I'm going to be talking about perception and wealth. I've recently really been diving into cleaning up my money story, my money mindset, abundance mindset, and all of that. And there's something that happened this week where I really felt a shift. And it seems so obvious now. And part of me is like, okay, it was obvious now, it wasn't obvious back then. It's okay, you experienced the shift now, let's focus on that. Because my mind can really tend to go to being hard on myself and like, why didn't you see this sooner and all that. So another pattern that I'm learning to shift out of. But this requires a little bit of a backstory. It had to have been over a year ago, because this was after Dad passed away. I remember it was around summertime, so it could have been maybe easily a year ago. But my brother had asked to go to the mall, and as I was finding parking, one of the things that I've gotten really good at is manifesting really good parking. Because as a projector whose energy ebbs and flows, I tend to be very mindful of how I use my energy, just to make sure that I have enough energy to do the things that need to be done and things like that, especially now that my physical support system has kind of been downsized a bit since Dad passed away. Dad was really good at helping me run errands and driving places. And I find that even though driving doesn't feel like a huge task, it's the focus that driving requires that I feel like can take a lot out of me, especially if there's a lot of traffic and things like that. But anyways, we're going to the mall, and as I'm parking, I started thinking about how sad I was that I no longer got to experience being dropped off at the entrance of places. Dad would always drop me off in the front, and my brother would usually get out with me. And he did it mostly for me because he knew that saving those extra steps meant a lot to me, and then he would go park the car. Now, since Dad was no longer around, I didn't have that luxury before, or I didn't have that luxury now. And I started thinking about how I had taken that simple thing for granted. So I'm thinking all of this inside my head. And this time, I normally wouldn't have expressed it out loud, but as I was learning to play with expressing my thoughts a little more, I share with my brother how I had this thought and how I felt sad that Dad wasn't around anymore, and how I felt like I had lost my princess lifestyle. And my brother says, a few encouraging words, and then we kind of shake it off and decide to go have a little fun and walk around the mall. We go into the mall, he goes off his way, I go off my way, and as I'm it hadn't even been 2 or 3 minutes, I'm walking through the mall, and all of a sudden I feel like my stomach starts to hurt. Now back then I didn't know what I know now. I think I've always had a lot of awareness of what's going on inside of my body, but I didn't always have the right language or the best language to describe what that was or to know what it was. Back then, pretty much my entire life, I would describe things, or I would describe my state as I feel bad or I don't feel as bad. But I really haven't experienced waking up and feeling really good. A lot of that, it's been just a handful of times where I wake up feeling really good. So as I'm walking through the mall, I am getting more and more aware of this discomfort. It wasn't a sharp pain, but it's maybe a little bit more on the dull side, but it was to the point where I was starting to get a little bit worried, because being the only person that drives now, I was thinking, how am I going to get home if I start feeling worse? We just got to the mall. I don't want to cut the trip short. And, I'm trying to coach myself through the what I'm feeling. It's okay. Just breathe. You're fine. Don't panic. trying to soothe myself so that things don't escalate a lot quicker than they need to. So I don't remember exactly what ended up happening, if I just sat down somewhere and then waited for my brother in the car. I don't remember. But when he was done with the mall, I think he asked to go somewhere else, but because he saw that I really wasn't feeling well, he was like, let's just go home so you can go lay down and rest. We get home, I lay down, and at this point, like, it's getting harder to move. Really, really uncomfortable. And I remember crawling into bed and just grabbing a blanket and curling up. And I don't remember if I started to cry. I don't remember, but more time went by, and it was getting like closer and closer to like going to sleep. And I really started to get worried because the pain wasn't going away. I couldn't figure out what triggered it. And I started praying more intensely and saying to God, look, I would really appreciate some help and guidance, because I would really like to be able to sleep through the night. It's getting to the point where like I'm getting scared. I don't want to go to the hospital. The hospital has a lot of like negative connotations and brings back so much stuff for me that like I don't want to go. And also like no health insurance. How am I going to get there? Like just the ambulance bill would set us back. Like, so all these thoughts are starting to, compound. So I pause long enough and I get this intuitive hit. Let's call it an intuitive hit of looking into muscle testing and seeing if it's a trapped emotion. I'm like, oh, of course, like, why didn't I think of that sooner? But in my distress and the discomfort and the pain I was feeling, I didn't even think about it, because like when you're in pain, you just can't think as clearly. So I pull out my phone. I have the chart saved in my phone because I have had to use it a lot throughout my life. And I start muscle testing, and one of the emotions, which right now I can't even remember what it was, I got a yes for. And as soon as I got a yes, I immediately go through the emotion code by Dr. Bradley Nelson to release the trapped emotion. And I started to feel the relief of like, oh my gosh, that was it. That's all air quotes it was. It was a trapped emotion. And then when I'm retracing my steps, I get this insight, let's say, of thinking back to when I said I miss my princess lifestyle. That's what triggered the trapped emotion. And back then, I didn't know how to process the emotion like I do now. And I also didn't realize that I was experiencing an emotion or a feeling. I was looking at it more as like, oh my gosh, something is happening in my body and it doesn't feel good. And that's basically been the story of my life. It hasn't been till like very, very recently that I realized that all the times that I thought that I felt bad, or that I felt like my blood sugar was plummeting, or that my blood pressure was plummeting, they were all times I was experiencing emotion. So that's been like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. Like I didn't know that until now. But anyways, that's kind of like the backstory. And this week I was thinking about that time, because I've also been having this other conversation with another self-projected projector, and I feel like all that also kind of like brought this to the surface. But I started contemplating this as I was getting ready for the day this last week, and this thought of like, I miss my princess lifestyle popped up again. But not from like, that's how I felt. It's just that memory came up. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting. And I had just had this conversation where I was using like all these analogies of like king and queen and all this stuff. So I think my brain was finally able to receive that insight, or be able to see it differently. And essentially like the epiphany that I had was, oh my gosh, like all this time, especially since Dad passed away, I've been perceiving myself as like going from princess to pauper type of thing. And I kept getting this this movie pop into my mind of the Little Princess, where it's like a live action, because I know they have different versions. I want to say it's from the early 90s maybe, but the storyline is that her father he goes to war and he gets wounded, but everybody thinks he died, so she is put up like in this boarding place, but she does not receive the best treatment. And there's like this neighbor guy. I'm really going like, this might not be accurate because it's been a minute since I watched the film and I haven't been able to get a hold of it to watch it again. But she's like dreaming of like a very luxurious lifestyle that she was used to and no longer had because her father passed away. And towards the end of the movie, spoiler alert, it turns out that her father didn't die. He was just injured in the war and he lost his memory. But when he regained his memory, he comes back to get her. And then she goes back to living the life she was used to. And not that she really cared about that. Like, she was more happy that her dad wasn't, that her dad was still alive. But that's kind of like the imagery that popped into my mind. And I started contemplating this concept of like perception. And part of like, before, like, I would have been really hard on myself, but now I see it was not only the grief of losing dad, another loss, another huge loss. Also, like, added to that, the worry, like, how am I going to provide for myself? Not, having had that experience. Like, I always had a pretty privileged lifestyle where everything was provided for me, to the point where I kind of see like how that didn't quite help me, because I didn't learn some of the skills that I had to learn after my parents passed away. And thinking back, I think it would have been nice to be able to learn those things while I had the support. It would have been a lot easier. And not to say that things didn't work out anyways, but now in retrospect, I kind of see that even though everyone had a good intention in mind, it didn't really. Like, it's a little counterintuitive. It would have been better if, I would have been empowered instead of sheltered and coddled and overprotected. Not to say that being protected, like, obviously it should be a thing for children, but in my case at least, I think it went to like the extreme. And I can see where this was coming from my parents. They had really tough childhoods and they wanted to avoid me having to face a lot of the hardships they faced. So anyways, it was what it was. But I started thinking about why did I perceive myself as having lost the princess lifestyle and going into kind of like pauper vibes, instead of up-leveling and seeing it as like, okay, yeah, I may no longer be a princess, but now that mom and dad are gone, king and queen vibes, I inherit everything that they worked to have and build, being like the house and a car, be pretty basic, pretty big basic, what do I call them? Let's just go with things that not a lot of people have. So I'm like, oh my gosh, like all this time I've been seeing myself as like I can't think of the proper word I want to use, but it's like I went from being at level 10 to being at level 0 or in the negatives because of the worry, mainly financial worry. And I didn't realize that I could just shift my perception, my perspective, and instead of seeing it as like, now you're a beggar on the streets trying to figure things out, now you went from being a princess to being queen of our empire, of their legacy. You have a house. You have a house, and the house is like, there's just a couple more payments and it's completely paid off. Like, how many people can say that, they're going to be mortgage free? And the car, like, you have a really nice car. Like, you know what it's like to have a car that isn't reliable. And this car, like, we really shouldn't have been able to get it. Yeah, it was like a leap of faith. And we did. So you have a house and you have a car. And all this time you've been worrying. And yet, like, the worry has clouded your perception, and you haven't really been able to see and allow yourself to feel that you have had more than enough. I know you have a lot of plans, a lot of renovations that the house needs, because a couple of years, like, we were in a really deep state of survival mode, and a lot of things slipped through the crack. There are a lot of repairs that the house needs, but you have a house, and that's gonna be no big deal. Like, let's focus on feeling more like a queen, instead of like you're no longer a princess and it's the end of the world and you're gonna have to go and live on the streets and, you know, all that stuff, which isn't true. Like, it isn't true. So there was that pretty big shift. And then I also had this other, like, reframe where I was asking myself, okay, how can I see this differently? And one thing that popped up that I have said before is how growing up, like, I was never really required to work or to chip in with bills or anything like that. But I always did contribute in some way. I paid for, like, my first car that I used to go to college. I paid for my books. I got a full scholarship. And at that time, because I didn't live on campus, I had enough money left over where I would use that money to buy books, and I would save what I had left over. That's how I got my first car. And I would also pay for my insurance, which was a huge chunk, because being such a young driver, my parents' insurance premium did go up basically times 2 because of me. So I did pay my insurance. And I was paying, like, my expenses, and if there were anything like shoes, or, like, I've always been very much into fashion, accessories, bags that I like I would pay for my stuff. I would pay for my food. I would treat my parents to dinner now and then. So I started to realize how I had been saying all along that I did pay for my expenses. I didn't pay for housing. Like, I always paid my car. Like, when I upgraded to a different car, like, I made my car payment, which at that time was almost $600 when I got the Beamer. So I did, like, I hadn't realized that I was capable of providing for my expenses. Because I didn't pay rent, there was all this guilt and shame of, like, oh, I don't pay rent. So I wasn't recognizing myself or appreciating all the expenses that I was covering on my own through my business. And after, I graduated from college, I started my own business, and I did really, really well. Considering how little I worked, like, I always equated it to working like half of a part-time and making more than what Dad made working full-time in a month. And I didn't even really think about it. It didn't feel like work. A lot of this shifted after Mom passed away, and after Dad passed away, work started feeling more of like an obligation. And this has to do with, like, the, not only the grief, but the transition, a really big transition, and kind of like not having a lot of support through that. So I took this concept of, like, okay, all this time that I've been thinking that I can't cover my expenses, that's a lie. That's not necessarily true, because before I was covering all my expenses. So if I would take that piece and kind of see, like, if that means I am totally able and I'm totally capable of covering my expenses. So that must mean that if my expenses now got a little bit bigger, so should my capacity to cover that. Like, it should mirror that, because I do. I have been providing for myself. Dad was more than happy to pay rent. He never, like, threw that in my face or anything. Like, for him, it was a pleasure. I love living at home. I kind of felt like if I did live on my own, it would be kind of a waste of money because I would want to be at home anyways. So I'm like, okay, let me take that piece and reframe it and see it more as like, okay, I am capable of covering my expenses. And if my expenses got bigger, that doesn't have to impact or change the fact that I can provide for myself. And of course, like, I totally believe and have gotten like deeper in seeing God as my source. And I also needed to take some time to recognize myself for what I could do for myself, not diminishing God's role in my life or how he provides, but also, giving myself the credit, boosting my confidence, boosting my self-esteem so that it would help empower me. Because before, I see how I was living from a state of a lot of worry, a lot of fear, a lot of distrust in life, a lot of worrying about the future, which was taking me out of the present moment. And as I've started to trust more and be more patient, and again, like, allowing myself to feel whatever it is that I'm feeling and allowing myself to process that and asking myself, how can I see this differently? Asking for guidance. God, help me see this differently. One small shift, one small, powerful, potent shift, and seeing how much that can change. And like, oh, okay, I think I'm starting to understand how it works. And I like this and a couple of other things that I've done. I've really, really noticed a change in my experience with money, where I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, I'm getting it. And it feels really good. Like, it feels like a lot of relief of like, okay, I can do this. But like before, it was more like, I can do this, I can do this. But there was a little bit of like, there was a lot of doubt, a lot of worry. I was saying it, but I wasn't really feeling it, not really believing it, wanting to believe it. Like, I have to believe this because otherwise, what am I going to do? And now I feel the shift. It's more like, yes, like I really am starting to believe that I can do this. And it feels really, really good compared to before, where I just feel like my entire body tense up, like all my shoulders and my neck. And now it's kind of like there's laughter. Like every time I think about it, I'm like, oh my gosh, like what were you thinking? Like, duh, of course. Like, could you demote yourself to pauper status instead of elevating yourself to like queen vibes? Like, hello. So I just wanted to share that because one, I thought it was funny. I mean, it wasn't funny during the process of learning that, but so simple. Just learning to change my perception, because that's all it was. It was a perception, and asking myself, is that true? Does it have to be true? So, okay, that's what I wanted to share. If you got any takeaways from this, if there's anything you'd like to share from your own personal experience, I invite you to comment down below. I always love reading comments, and I do my best to reply to them. It's one of my favorite ways to connect with people. So yeah, I invite you to leave any comments or questions down below. If you'd like to follow along on my journey, you can find me on Instagram. My handle is @JeannieSalcedo. There and on my website, you can find more information of different ways of working with me. And that's it for this one. I will talk to you next time. Bye.